Well, hi, y'all. If you're visiting, my name is Steve, and I'm one of the pastors here. And you've come at a unique time when we're talking and working our way through kind of an emphasis of getting outside of our walls and serving our world. The only problem with serving our world is so many times it can just seem completely overwhelming. I mean, if you just block out whether Iran has a nuclear missile about to be launched and block out all of the things that are going on everywhere else, life can tend to just get overwhelming. Even as the worship team, got together and prayed for the services before you guys were all here, I heard one young lady say, there's just too much distracting me right now. But the truth is that in a unique passage in Hebrews chapter 11, when the writer of Hebrews lays out all of these different people who have gone through and been used by God in great and magnificent ways, he says in the next chapter, he starts the next chapter by saying, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, since we come from such a heritage, certainly we can be motivated by those who have gone before. And so tonight, I want to take you to my favorite New Testament church. It's a church that you may not even be aware of, and we've been working our way through this. We saw how first the church in Jerusalem, when Christ was resurrected and taken to heaven, the church kind of hung out in Jerusalem for a long time until some persecution came. A guy named Stephen was stoned, and a guy named Saul showed up and started, it said that he was breathing murderous threats to the church. Everything about what he did was filled with hate towards this group of people called the Way, or the Nazarenes, is what they were first called. Then we saw that as they began to get scattered because of the persecution, Tom Randall came last week and he talked to us a little bit about one of those guys, Philip, who started talking to people who were outside of his immediate comfort zone. He was a Jew that was talking to a North African and someone who was outside of the Jewish traditions and shared what he knew about Christ. And so now I want to show you how that same kind of mindset began to spread inside of a church. And this church of mine that I want to introduce you to just took the thing and just went crazy with it. So if you brought a Bible, open it up, Acts chapter 11, and we'll take a look at it together. This is a church that doesn't have any letters named after it. You're thinking, it's probably the church in Ephesus or Corinth or one of those things. Now, you'll see in a minute. It's actually the church in a place called Antioch of Syria. Now, this place, its name has to be distinguished by Antioch of Syria because there are 15 Antiochs in the New Testament times. It's kind of like Athens. Well, when you hear Athens, some of you may think Athens, Greece. Others of you from the south would think Athens, Georgia. But everyone who's in the know would think Athens, Texas. So each of those Athenses have to be established by there, and this particular place is Antioch of Syria. Chapter 11 of Acts, verse 19. Meanwhile, the believers who had been scattered during the persecution after Stephen's death, that's what we have been talking about the past few weeks, they traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch of Syria. Now, because we're not very familiar with this time, if you can imagine in your mind what it would look like to see the Middle East, the coast along the Mediterranean Sea, north of Jerusalem along the coast, that would have been the place of Phoenicia. Cyprus would have been an island just off of that, out in the Mediterranean. And then Antioch of Syria, well, let me just show you. This is Antioch today. It's called today Antakya. It's in southern Turkey. There are about 100,000 people who live there. It is a shadow of what it was in the time of Jesus' day, where at least 500,000 people lived. which is a humongous place, third largest in the Roman kingdom. Next picture shows you some windows actually out of a big cave area that they are almost certain that Christians worshiped in at the time of this church that we're talking about. It has geographically it's wonderful, and it has a beautiful river that goes through it. You can see that river right here. And also, it was a very sports-minded town. Here's a mosaic. The two most famous chariot teams in all of the Roman Empire both came from Antioch of Syria. So they're a sports-crazy town. There were two teams, the Reds and the Greens. And these horses raced all over the Roman kingdom. And in fact, they established such crazy loyalty that whenever these two horse teams would race, almost always there were riots during the games, big fights. But that's not enough. I want to show you some other things about it. So I've gone to one of my favorite tools. I hope that you use this tool at home. It's Google Earth. So let's start out. Let's come home here to where we are. And I'll show you. I always like doing this because on all of the material that you have, there's a triangle that you see often about the West Gate, and it's got the little dots inside of it. Well, the reason that we did that was because of this triangle right here that's actually part of where we are. You can see that this picture's dated because we have our new building here, but our old building is still there, and our new one is not up. And Motel 6, which will soon be history, is still there. And we want to go to Antioch. So let's fly there together. Oops. Now, these are the Bible lands that when you read about in the New Testament. Jerusalem, of course, is here. It is in the book of Acts, there are two primary churches responsible for the spread of the gospel. The one is Jerusalem, and the second one is Antioch of Syria, which is right here in present-day southern Turkey. Now, these points that I've kind of given to you will come out later in the story, but let me go ahead and say to you that later on, in fact, for the next 5 centuries, there will be 3 main churches in Christian, spreading throughout what's going on in Christianity. It will be Antioch of Syria. It will be Alexandria in North Africa. And of course, it will be Rome in Italy. And then somewhere around 7th and 8th century, the papacy, the popes and things started coming into play, and that place became much more important than everything else. This church, in just a minute, we'll toggle. I said I wouldn't toggle back to it, but I'm going to toggle back to it. Freak y'all out. Okay, here we go. That gives you an idea. Let me show you some of Antioch while we're here. Because this makes a big deal. Antioch is a very important city. In the Bible times because of its location where it is geographically. If you remember when we studied the church in Corinth, we saw how critical the location of where that church was located. This place is very important because it's on all of the primary roads that are leading throughout the trade to the east in Asia and into all of Europe and into North Africa. So all of the roads would come through here. It's too dry out here and too much desert, so they can't travel through there. They would come right through here, and then they would go east, and they would go up here to north and into Europe. Now, it's also, let me give you a little bit better view of that. If you would look now, you can see why it would have been. See how it's the elevation of the different things, how the road would naturally flow through these 2 mountain ranges. And there's water actually here, so they would want to go through there. And then they can work their way east, or they can work their way towards Europe. Mountain ranges here, perfect place for a road. Does that make sense? Okay. I want to straighten back out. And we'll come back to it in a minute. They preached the word of God, but only to Jews in Antioch of Syria. However, some of the believers who went to Antioch from Cyprus and Cyrene began preaching to the Gentiles about the Lord Jesus, and the power of the Lord was with them, and a large number of these Gentiles believed and turned to the Lord. It was God's intention all along for Israel to be a nation that was a light to the world and to take this gospel out. It took persecution in Jerusalem to scatter the church and to get them about the business because they got comfortable with one another. Then they got scattered out, and as they did and began to share the message, just like we saw in the message with Kids Club, what's actually happened is you think there's nobody that wants to really listen. Outside of this little audience right here, you think we're surrounded by just a bunch of people who don't care and don't want to hear. But the reality is they're very open to it. That's what they found in Antioch of Syria. And the first characteristic of this church that I want us to draw from tonight is that they speak of Jesus often and openly. They begin to talk about Christ. They show up in a town that they don't know. It's a very wealthy town, very, very proud of how much they own and very materialistic. It's wealthy because of being on the trade route the way that it is, and it's a humongous town. Lots of slaves are there. In fact, of the 500,000 or the 500,000 that I spoke to you about, they say that the population was about 300,000 free people, 200,000 slaves. And in this environment, they began to speak openly and often about what Christ had done by going to the cross and paying for sin. And they found an open audience. Verse 22. When the church at Jerusalem heard what had happened, they sent Barnabas in Antioch. When he arrived, Barnabas, he saw this evidence of God's blessing, and he was filled with joy. And he encouraged the believers to stay true to the Lord. Barnabas was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and strong in faith. And many people were brought to the Lord. And then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, who's been missing for several years. The word and the reputation of this church in Antioch begins to spread to where soon all of the leaders that are still part of the church in Jerusalem begin to hear of this, and they find someone who is reputable and strong in character and say, go check this place out. Barnabas goes up there, and when he gets there, he says, this place needs a leader. And I think we'll go get Saul, because there was something. I think that there's probably, most churches would not have been open to having Saul as their pastor. He had blood on his hands. But this church somehow seems open. Saul comes in. His name actually they start to refer to him as Paul. And the reason that you don't have a letter to the Antioch church in the New Testament is that they had the dude who wrote most of the letters talking to them every week. An amazing place that was going on. And the second characteristic was there was a sense of expectation of God's presence among them. I don't know if you're here and you're visiting it, but you want to look for a church where there's a sense of expectation. That if you miss a weekend, you just might miss some of the best stuff that ever happens. I don't know what you've been doing this summer, but just a few weekends ago, we baptized more people than we've ever baptized in a day at the beach. Ever. Just a couple of weeks ago now from here, we did a deal where we asked for decisions. There were over 60 people in the weekend stand as a rededication and commitment or a first-time decision for Jesus Christ in our services. Last week, thank you, Mom. Last week, we didn't even give a call when Tom spoke, and I had 5 cards of people who rededicated their life to Christ. There's a sense of expectation when God's people gather. I hope you have that. I hope you sense that. Certainly, they had it at this church here in Antioch, and I believe we have it here. Well, when he found him, he brought him back to Antioch. And both of them stayed there with all the church for a full year. Can you imagine having Barnabas and Paul every Sunday or for a year preaching? Teaching large crowds of people. And it was in Antioch that the believers were first called Christians. See, we think that Christians, that probably the disciples made up this term and somehow it just began right from the very first. But the truth is that believers in Jesus' day referred to themselves as a part of a sect called the Way. And people who were outside of the way mostly referred to them around Jerusalem when the church was first starting as Nazarenes, which was very derogatory. I believe that even this first time when Christians was used, and I don't have, but the research I've done, I believe it was probably used as a derogatory term. It means little Christs. Have you ever been part of something where you got aligned with a certain amount of thought and someone began to talk to you like, oh, you're a Fortnitean, and I don't know, I could try to make up a new word. You're so into the 49ers that everything's like, that's not a good example. Let me give you a good example. When I was teaching in public schools, I was very open about my faith, and God allowed and protected me to have an open Bible on my desk in Texas and teach with that mindset of being a Christian. It was very open about it. And I can remember that there were teachers and some students in the school who referred to other students as part of being a Cliffordian. And whatever Clifford's doing, they're into that. Which they did not mean as a compliment. I took it as one. I mean, why not? What are you going to do? Christians, I think, were originally called that and made fun of. Oh, that's some of those little Christs. They do all kinds of weird things. But somehow, they realized, those Christians in Antioch, wait a minute, that's exactly what we want to be. We want to model our life after Christ. What they meant as a derogatory term, we embrace as our identity. And it stuck. Now, where was I? When he found him, Paul, did I read that part already? Yeah. And during this time, prophets traveled from Jerusalem to Antioch. Now, instead of them just hearing about what's going on up there, now people are starting to want to go up to Antioch to see what's going on. This is a completely consistent thing that the church still does today. Whenever any church is doing really well, their pastor normally writes a book and they host a conference. And everybody wants to hear about what's going on. And certainly that's what was going on at that time. Can you imagine the kind of church that had this kind of teaching going on all the time? And the characteristic of it, this church here is God's word is taught and obeyed. Taught and obeyed. It's a radical transformation of this very materialistic mindset, very wealthy mindset, and they begin to embrace the responsibility, what it means to be a little Christ. That this whole idea of making disciples, they fully embrace. And when somebody makes fun of them, say, you're one of those little Jesuses, they said, yeah, go ahead. It's like, you remember, it used to be kind of a derogatory term to be called a Jesus freak. Remember that? Oh, you're a Jesus freak. Yeah, okay. I started thinking, yeah, I guess I kind of am. That'd be me, Jesus freak. All right, verse 28. One of them, named Agabus, stood up in one of the meetings and predicted by the Spirit that a great famine was coming upon the entire Roman world. This was fulfilled during the reign of Claudius. So the believers in Antioch decided to send relief to the brothers and sisters in Judea, everyone giving as much as they could. This they did, entrusting their gifts to Barnabas and Saul to take to the elders of the church in Jerusalem. During a worship service, there's a man who stands up and says, I believe there's going to be a famine, and that famine materialized. And brothers 150 miles south, maybe 175, are experiencing incredible hardship. And this church rallies to people they've never met, they've never seen. And they give, the text says, everyone giving as much as they could. Now, it's difficult here to keep things straight because we're asking you to give all the time. This has become a reality to us. I know that many of you, you're confused. I'm giving to my general fund, and I'm not sure there was a 50-50 thing, and now there's this global compassion, which used to be called Faith Promise, which, by the way, might still be called Faith Promise. We're going to still talk about that. And then, wait a minute, I just sponsored a child through Compassion International, and there's a lot of these things. So I want to take just a moment and explain to you how we do things here. If you're visiting here, this is not an appeal for you to get involved in any way. You shouldn't give to a church that you don't know. Do not think of this as any kind of an appeal to get into your wallet. You don't know us. You shouldn't trust us. You shouldn't give your money to people you don't trust. Now, but there are some of you who are trying to figure out, what the heck are we doing? So can I take a minute to explain it? Would that be all right? Okay, how about this side? Is it okay over here? Okay. Now, if you give in the general fund, if you write a check and you don't earmark where it goes into the general fund, and that helps with all of the ministries here as well as ministries that are going on globally and locally with things like Kids Club and other things. A percentage of our general fund goes to global efforts. So if you're here and you're saying, I want to make sure that at least some of my money is going to the world, it absolutely is. And your general fund money, there's a percentage of it every year. We're always trying to push that percentage as best we can to give a lot of that money away. But we wanted to give more. And so we introduced 9 years ago now this concept of faith promise. Faith promise is something that we do on top of our tithing, and that is 100% of what you pledge there goes there. So here's my faith promise card. Hopefully you can't see it to know my number. It's filled out. I'm ready to turn it in this weekend. I fill out it's Global Missions Pledge, faith promise, same thing. Okay? I fill this out, and I know that 100% of this money goes to support things that are going on locally and globally. Now, the difference is when this card here will help generate money that's a lot of projects, a lot of special things. If somebody needs a refrigerator in the Philippines, if we want to try to help send a kid to school, if we want to try to do a special trip, we use this money that's called Faith Promise or pledge money, and it all goes outside of our walls. If we want to do something special, buy a projector for Anderson School, we grab some Faith Promise money and use it to give it away. Okay, so your general fund gives money away, but only a small percentage, and then you've got 100% of that one. Now, you also, if you've been around here a little bit, you also know we did a 50-50 campaign, and that 50-50 campaign raised $1.15 million to give away. That is going to be used for a large projects that the Faith Promise dollars could never support because we don't generate enough. This generates a lot of money. I don't want to sound like it's not. It's a lot of money, and it's used to support things throughout the year, little things as we go. But we wanted to be able to see if we could build a school, if we could build an orphanage, if we could build a clinic, if we could do some different things that were bigger. And so we challenged you guys on 50-50. And if you give money to 50-50, half of that goes to debt reduction on the new building we're going to open in 1 week. And the other half of it goes to big projects that we have identified in places like Haiti, Philippines, Africa, and some things locally. Now, there's a fourth area, as if you hadn't given enough. There's a fourth area that comes along on a very regular basis, and it's usually centered around holidays. And we'll do things like Advent Conspiracy, where we'll ask you, let's pull our monies together and dig wells, and we dug 30 of them last Christmas. Or we'll do something where we say, let's pull some funds together and let's see if we can do backpacks. There's all kinds of opportunities throughout the year that you can't really know when they're going to come up, but we're going to make regular asks, and you respond in generous ways. Let me just say this. I had a man come to me who was brand new here, and he came in what would seem like the worst time to ever visit a church. He came right in the middle of our 50-50 campaign. when we were talking about giving money. And he said, I have never seen a more generous group of people in my entire life. And which I told him, me neither. So this is not an attempt to try to make anyone feel pressured or guilty or manipulated to give money. This is an explanation of how you've got opportunities to give if you can. I had someone contact us this past week, and they said, man, I did all I could at 50-50. I can't do anything on this other one. Great. I don't know very many people here that have already done all they can, right? I mean, I just wanted to high five the lady. I've looked at my budget. I had another woman 2 weekends ago when Kayvon spoke. We spoke right over here, right in this area right here. And in tears, she said, I don't have any more. I want to do this, but I pledged too much at that other one. I said, great. Oh my gosh. I think there are people in the room that have given all they can, to which God says, you're amazing. The guy speaking hasn't. Okay, so that puts you in better stead than me. I've got some I can still do, and that's why I filled out a card. So those are the different areas. Does that help? If it doesn't, raise a hand and say, yeah, but, or let's get it, because I think it's confusing. And it's confusing for a good reason, okay? Two good reasons. Well, one's just an excuse, and one's a good reason. It's confusing, one, because the guy who's telling you is not totally clear all the time. Okay, sometimes I'm a little more excited than I am factual. I admit that. I admit that. So that makes things unclear. But it's also confusing because it is a deep passion of the DNA of this church to give money away. Find me a church that over the last 5 years has given 22 to 25% of their money away. Find me one. And by God's grace, because of the 50-50 deal, we're going to get close to, well, we'll see. We'll just see what happens. I don't want to box us in. We're going to give a lot more money away than we ever have. This characteristic is they share their resources generously. If you want to know how I see our church, I see our church as a resource church. As I see how God has placed us at such a time as this, He's placed us in a very difficult region to where if we're not missional, we'll get killed. And He's also blessed us with resources. And I know economically it's a hard time, but we are still the rich. And He's blessed us with those resources so that we will share. Listen, men and women, there are tens of thousands of children alive today because of what you're doing with your money as you give it here. Children fed, schools stayed open, kids taken off the street, children rescued out of trafficking and in all kinds of sex trade. All kinds of things are going on. Lastly, I want to skip to chapter 13 and show you one more picture of Antioch. Acts 13, verse 1, it says, among the prophets and teachers of the church at Antioch of Syria were Barnabas, Simeon, called the black man, Lucius from Cyrene, Manaen, the childhood companion of King Herod Antipas, and Saul, or Paul. What that basically is an all-star lineup of the preachers of this day. I mean, these are amazing teachers and preachers. And one day, these men were worshiping the Lord and fasting. And the Holy Spirit said, dedicate Barnabas and Saul for the special work to which I have called them. So after more fasting and prayer, the men laid their hands on them and sent them on their way. Can you imagine? Now, I know all those dudes are good, but let me just tell you, the best two are Barnabas and Paul. That's their best two preachers. And they say, why don't we share? We've shared our resources. Why don't we share? And so, toggle back to my computer. Here he is in Antioch right here. This church sends Paul out and Barnabas, and they go right in here in this little area at first. They just go right around in here, visit a few places, and come back. This area, by the way, is known as Galatia. That should sound familiar to some. They come back, they report. They say, way to go. Get some food, go back, sick them. They go back out, they come back out this time, they go further. They come out around in here, they'll work their way out, see some of the people they saw before, then they work their way over here towards Ephesus, and they go up to this little spot right here. They keep trying to go up in this area, but God won't let them. They come to right here, cross over this little tiny place right here, and take the gospel to Europe. They work their way down here. They come down to Corinth, which we've studied. They come to Athens. They work across back to Ephesus. They come back, and then they'll do it a third time again. The characteristic of this church is they reproduce themselves. They share their best resources. Now, before you freak out and say, oh, Steve's telling us he's leaving, let me show you how we've been doing that and you haven't possibly been understood. But just let me go back a few years and name a few. We had a guy named Darren on our staff. He wanted to do young adult ministry. We paid him for 9 months to go to the best person we knew that was doing young adult ministry and said, go pastor with him. Learn how to do it and then go do it. Dennis Lowe was here part-time. His family needed full-time work. A church called me and said, we are looking for someone to do small groups, and it's a full-time position. Inside my heart, I said, can't help you. And then he serves at Valley Church, oddly enough, along with Darren. Right here, I don't even know what y'all are doing here today. Y'all just find yourself over on this side of the hill? Sabbatical. Yeah. You've been there long enough to get a sabbatical. When I came, you were serving as the interim worship guy, and you said, I believe God has marked my life to do full-time ministry. You remember all this? And I said, man, I believe so too. Sit under Mark Averill. Get back to school. You were selling fiberglass or something. Nothing wrong with fiberglass. Not a thing. It paid the bills. It was fine. And now you've been at a church in Scotts Valley leading worship. Your family's there. Look, who's this young man? It's not you. That can't be your son. He was like prenatal before we saw him. He's pretty small. So a living example that I didn't even plan on right here. We've done a co-plant with GRX. Since I've got another live example over here, Joel King. Several months ago, a church came to me and said, we think we're in trouble. If we don't get some help through this transition, we might just not make it. It's a church called, I'll just go ahead and say, it's a church called Lincoln Glen in Willow Glen. And because of your generosity, we said, you can have half of Joel King. Well, I thought that was pretty generous. I mean, I wasn't going to give him the whole Joel King, but I gave him, and it ends up I gave him the better half. I mean, we got stuck with the... The point is that there's more ways to share as a church than to just share your money. And I couldn't have planned this any better. Can y'all come back next hour? The reality of it is that God has blessed us here with resources that if we don't do church in such a way where we raise the water level of the pond so that all churches get better, I think God will hold us accountable for that. If we turn inward, if we say enough, we got our little thing working, I think God will not be pleased. So, I'm supposed to be done by now, aren't I? Yeah, that's what I thought. Let me give you this. Band, come on up. This is the smooth transition I told you about. I want to be part of a community that will stand up and be counted for Christ and his kingdom. I know economic times are hard, and if you're at a point where you can't do anything else, don't participate in Faith Promise a penny. Don't. That's not what this is about, because there's lots of other things you can do. Lots of other things. And there's more to being standing up and being counted than just giving our money. Sometimes that's the easiest thing to do. Letting go of staff members we love is much harder. But when I heard this song that is about to be done, and it started to build at the end and talk about those who have come before us and have sacrificially given, I said, when the saints come marching in, I want to be in there. When God lines his people up, I want to be counted faithful. So I would encourage you, whatever you can do for Faith Promise, you just do that. There is no part too small. My card is fairly small. It's not as big as we've done in the past because we've extended in some other areas. You might fill out just $10 a month, $5 a month, $1 a month, one-time gift of $5. It all counts. Because we want to be part of the cloud of witnesses that have gone before, that have stood up and said, I will be faithful. Here am I. Here am I. Wait till you hear this song.